Take that Madeleine cookie. We take a bite, it tastes good, and we say yum. At the very core of that yum, the earliest brain processing in a rewarding experience is the release of the chemical dopamine by the nerve cells, the neurons, in the midbrain. Neuroscientists used to think that dopamine was the sole chemical of pleasure. Now they understand that dopamine handles just one particular but very specific part of a larger pleasurable experience. Dopamine tells the brain when a reward is salient, noticeable, important, and when a reward is better than expected. Dr. David Reddish of the University of Minnesota explains dopamine's role like this. Let's say you're at a gumball machine, and you want to buy a gumball. So you put in your quarter, and due to a freak of gumball machine physics, you get 2 gumballs. This is when the midbrain releases dopamine. Dopamine tells the brain when a reward is especially good, better than expected, and to pay attention to that reward because it might be better than other things in the past for survival. So let's say you put another quarter into the gumball machine, and this time you get 1 gumball. This time the midbrain does not release any excess dopamine. It's not that the gumball doesn't taste good, it's just not a reward that was better than expected. Just to push your luck, you put 1 more quarter into the gumball machine, and this time you get no gumball. This time the neurons in the midbrain release less dopamine because this reward was worse than expected. It's in this way that dopamine acts as a learning signal to help the brain identify, prioritize, and then anticipate new and unexpected rewards over older predictable rewards. Dopamine is a chemical of pleasure, yes, but it handles one specific piece of pleasure. Dr. Terry Robinson and Dr. Kent Berridge of the University of Michigan believe that dopamine is more about drug wanting than drug liking. It's the first in what will be a series of neurochemicals, a kind of hedonic cascade that will create that larger pleasurable experience. What all natural pleasures have in common, things like food and sex, is their ability to release dopamine. But drugs cause huge surges of dopamine, far greater than the brain was ever meant to handle. Drugs fool the brain into thinking they are much, much better than expected. Every time the addict uses the drug and they get that surge of dopamine, their brain gets a message that the drug is better and better than expected, even though it's not, and has greater and greater survival value, even though the drug doesn't deserve that survival value, and it goes higher and higher on the survival priority list. And the drug climbs the survival list until finally it is in the #1 spot. Now for the addict, the drug is survival. And it's this irrational assignment of value that lies at the very heart of one of the most frustrating but fascinating features of addiction: persistent drug use despite negative consequences. If we were to lay out all the drugs that release dopamine, we might arrange them the way chemists arrange atoms into the periodic table of the elements by their class, structure, and properties. Except we will call our arrangement the periodic table of the intoxicants. We would have the usual drugs like alcohol and marijuana, cocaine and nicotine, but we would also find classes such as the stimulants, which contain crystal methamphetamine, or the entactogens, which are drugs that induce feelings of interpersonal closeness, such as ecstasy. We would also find the entheogens, drugs that create experiences of mystical significance. These used to be called the hallucinogens. They differ from the dissociants, drugs such as PCP and ketamine. Here's a big class, the sedative hypnotics. These are drugs that decrease anxiety and promote sleep. This would include drugs such as the barbiturates and the benzodiazepines like Valium and Xanax. Here are 2 sedative hypnotics that have a more recent history of abuse: GHB and Zolpidem, sold under the trade name Ambien. Down here are the opioids. These are the classic narcotic pain relievers: morphine, heroin, methadone. Here's hydrocodone, that's the main ingredient in Vicodin, an ancient one, opium, and an important newcomer used in the treatment of opioid addiction called buprenorphine. At the bottom of our periodic table of the intoxicants, we find the inhalants and the anabolic androgenic steroids. This is the dopamine hypothesis. What all addictive drugs have in common, whether they are uppers or downers, strong or weak, legal or illegal, is their ability to release dopamine in the pleasure areas of the brain. One immediate implication of the dopamine hypothesis is that if a person has a problem with one drug, they have a liability to develop a problem with any or all of the others. For instance, cocaine addicts often come to treatment quite willingly, but they make the mistake of refusing to stop drinking alcohol. Dopamine surges continue to insult the brain, and they find that they keep relapsing back to cocaine. Or the alcoholic who tries to stop drinking by switching to marijuana. When things get stressful and their craving kicks in, it's likely that they will be led back to alcohol. Likewise, people who are newly sober from drugs like heroin or methamphetamine, who continue to chain smoke or drink huge amounts of caffeinated beverages, they are still creating very small but real spikes of dopamine. Their craving may get worse. But what makes the dopamine hypothesis especially powerful is that it shows us that not only chemicals release dopamine, behaviors can do so as well. And there are people who can manipulate these behaviors, things like food, gambling, sex, and codependency, to get the same kinds of dopamine surges as the people on the chemical side. This is called cross-addiction. If a person tries to quit their chemical addiction but doesn't stop their behavioral addiction, they may have a very hard time staying sober from both. Once the brain has found something that is good for survival, it has to remember it. The brain uses a second neurochemical to do this, glutamate. Glutamate is the chemical of memory formation. It lays down memories of natural rewards like food. But drugs cause such huge surges of neurochemicals that glutamate locks the drug into memory. And everything that goes along with the drug, the people, the place, the time of day, the sights and smells of the moment, they become part of that memory. They are now drug cues, and if a person is ever exposed to that drug cue again, the other thing that glutamate does is it begins the motivation to get the drug. Glutamate is the chemical of drug memory and of drug seeking. The dopamine neurons send their reward processing up. They project from the VTA to the NA, and then to the frontal cortex. Now the frontal cortex becomes involved. It sends glutamate neurons back down to the midbrain. As the brain generates an experience of pleasure, the neurons going up release dopamine. And the neurons going down release glutamate. Normally, this up and down communication enables the brain to recognize and learn those things in the environment that are good for survival. Dopamine says, hey, this is important. Glutamate says, okay, I'll remember. Dopamine says, hey, I really want this. Glutamate says, fine, go and get it. That's the way this elegant but delicate system was meant to work. For food, for sex, for Madeline cookies. Drugs go straight to this mechanism and wipe it out. These surges of neurochemicals are like flash floods tearing through the landscape of the brain. Each use of the drug, every flash flood, ravages the brain's delicate physiology, sweeping away everything in its path. With time, deep channels are carved into the brain. Drug pathways become stronger and stronger. Normal pathways become weaker and weaker. Dr. Stephen Hyman of Harvard University calls addiction a pathological overlearning of the drug and all that goes with it. This isn't a normal memory. This is a drug hypermemory, and these memories may be permanent. They leave the addict vulnerable to relapse even after years of abstinence.
The smell and taste of things remain poised a long time, like souls, ready to remind us, waiting and hoping for their moment. They bear unfaltering, in a tiny and almost impalpable drop of their essence, the vast structure of recollection.